Bond, reading the Fleming novels, it was very clear to me. I was like some sort of anxious wife counting the number of drinks that Bond consumed. Was a functioning alcoholic. There's no, Ian Fleming was an alcoholic. He was a 2 bottles of vodka a day man, plus 80 cigarettes. So no wonder he died age 54. But Bond is a massive boozer. And there's a great line, I think it's in You Only Live Twice, which is that Bond realized that the 13th large whiskey had been a mistake. Well, that's a bottle and a half.
Hello. Today's episode is a chat with the acclaimed and best-selling author William Boyd. He's written countless books, including Solo, a Bond novel, as well as screenplays, operas, and he even orchestrated a brilliant art hoax with David Bowie. Last month, I had the chance to talk with him about his new book, Gabriel's Moon, the first in a trilogy of espionage novels set in the 1960s, featuring the hero Gabriel Dax. We cover that period, spy writing, and plenty of other subjects. I should mention that this episode first appeared on our sister podcast, Spy Masters, and you should definitely check it out, where my colleague Antonia Senior interviews spy authors, historians, and maybe even a few spooks themselves. If you can share this pod with a like-minded, I'd be hugely grateful, and any reviews are gratefully accepted. But without further ado, I'll hand you over to me talking with William Boyd. William, this is a great pleasure to have you on the Spy Masters podcast, but thank you very much. This is a real honor.
No, my pleasure. I'm really very happy to be here.
Well, I've just read Gabriel's Moon. Funnily enough, I suffer a bit of sleeplessness as well. So I was reading it at about 3 o'clock this morning.
Right.
Actually, partly exacerbating my sleeplessness because I just raced through it. The story is so compelling, of a protagonist thrown into the world of espionage, but it's got so many themes that I detected from a previous novel as well. So I wanted to sort of really ask you about that. Actually, Armadillo is one of your books that I've read that I hugely enjoyed, but there's obviously sleeplessness is an element in that. Then there is an insurance loss adjuster, though not a key character in your new novel. And there's a method of death as well. Am I too obsessed with Armadillo to think that there are similarities?
No, I don't think so. I think that, this is my 18th novel, and it's inevitable that, themes and obsessions will recur, and I'm not, and I sleep like a log, but I'm fascinated by insomnia and dreams and psychoanalysis. I've never been psychoanalyzed, but these are my interests. And of course, they just, anything I'm interested in tends to go into the novel I'm writing. So it's so you're absolutely right. There's insomnia, and Armadillo is in a way a kind of spy novel, even though the hero is a loss adjuster, but he changes identity depending on whatever loss he's going to adjust to make the people he's trying to rip off, as it were, feel secure. So these are themes: identity, pretense, mendacity, duplicity, that have been present in all my books. And so it's no surprise that when I'm writing a bona fide Cold War spy novel, they should re-emerge. And I'm quite happy for my long-time readers to pick up those echoes and those little clues, and because a writer's work is however disparate, is also a unity, and things that I've been interested in from the beginning of my writing career will doubtless keep reappearing.
Oh, well, that's good to hear. I guess, yes, Armadillo can certainly be seen as an espionage novel. I wanted to ask you this question because I have a kind of, it's not my theory, it's a theory of plenty of people have had, but I've had sort of skepticism as to the value of human intelligence, whether it's worth the risk. And because often with spies, you then have double agents, triple agents. And when you're involving human beings who are, of course, fallible, it becomes so risky, it seems pointless. And I wanted to get your view on that because it's so romantic and it's thrilling and it's exciting. But is it actually worth it?
Well,
In
I think,
reality, I think.
well, I mean, that's why I set my four spy novels, in the kind of analog world of the Cold War or World War One or World War Two, because today spying is all about surveillance and eavesdropping and electronically and with algorithms and computers. The old analog world of the agent in the field, I'm sure still sort of exists, but back in the Cold War, it was all we had to rely on. And of course, you're absolutely right. Human beings are fallible and they make mistakes, but they also can be quite clever. And so part of the pleasure of writing a spy novel in that era is to exploit the very humanity of the reluctant spies that I tend to write about. They're kind of suborned. They're not trained operatives, but they apart from James Bond. But
Mhm.
they they have to rely on their natural instincts and their own resources as a human being. And sometimes they find themselves surprisingly effective as spies, and sometimes they make terrible blunders. But I think that's what makes the genre appealing, because as I've said many times before, I think the spy novel, the espionage novel, is in a way a novel about the human condition writ large. We've all been betrayed, we've all betrayed, we've all lied, we've been lied to, we've all pretended to be different people when it suited us. So somehow the tropes of the spy world are very familiar to us. And I think that's why so many literary novelists, serious novelists, have moonlighted in that world, from Joseph Conrad to Graham Greene to Muriel Spark and Elizabeth Bowen and Ian McEwan and John Banville, etc., etc. Why do these very successful literary novelists take up this genre? And I think it's because it's a very interesting mirror of our own lives.
Do you like your books to be categorized as such? Because I mean, I'm always very wary of, putting books in a box. It seems very unfair. But what do you think about that?
Well, I don't really mind. They're all my novels, and they're all on the shelf in a row. And I don't have a category for comedies. I don't have a category for whole life novels or spy novels. They're all engaging and compelling narratives, I would say, and they're all written to the very best of my ability. So I leave it up to readers to categorize them. I don't categorize them. They're all, as I've often said, from my point of view, they all turned out very much as I hoped they would, and there are no runts in my litter. They stand alone and together to be judged. But I've written, every novel of mine is different in a way, and so I can't be categorized or under one particular label. And it depends what I feel like writing. And at the moment, after writing The Romantic, which is my last novel, which is a nearly 500 pages, a whole life novel set in the 19th century, to shift to Gabriel's Moon to write a terser, compelling spy novel was exactly what I wanted to do. And that now, I mean, I don't know if you know this, Oliver, but I'm actually going to write two sequels to this. So there's going to be a Gabriel Dax trilogy of novels, which is going to come out quite swiftly. There'll be one published next year in 2025 and one published in 2026. So I will have written three novels featuring this character in the 1960s, in the heart of the Cold War. And so it's, but I don't, in a way, declassify them. They are still, my novels, and I'm, very happy to write them and very happy to be judged, and but then there is no sense that, as Graham Greene called his thrillers, entertainments. These are novels that I am very proud of and give them my absolute full 100% writing ability.
Well, yes, that's very obvious off the page. So that's very pleasing to hear. He is a character who's very attractive, Gabriel Dax. I wanted to mention this actually. I'm delighted that you mentioned a wimpy.
Yes,
Are you like Gabriel Dax living in Chelsea or there or
yes,
thereabouts?
I
Yes,
am.
not many
Yes.
wimpies there, are there?
No, but there would have
There
been
would have been.
in 1961, 62, 63. I'm old enough to remember. I mean, I think they still exist,
Yeah,
Wimpy's, actually. Yeah,
I've been on the website. There are
yeah.
loads still around,
Yeah,
actually.
I haven't been there for a while, but of course, the 1960s pretty much coincided with my teenage years, so I have vivid memories of that period, even though I was a schoolboy and a young lad. I'm not writing about a period that I'm unfamiliar with, and I remember wimpy bars, and I remember seeing things like I remember seeing the first hippies in the early 60s, people with very long hair and beads and shaggy fur coats, which part of the cultural history of our times. But I was there witnessing it, even as a 14-year-old or a 16-year-old, and so it's a decade that I remember very, very clearly for all sorts of reasons, and so I'm very happy to revisit it.
Well, there's a female character, Faith Green, in this novel that then hopefully will reappear. It sounds like it's likely she will.
Oh yes, oh yes.
She's so mesmerizing. It's someone who you kind of know you're being manipulated, but you're helpless to say no.
Yes, I mean it's a kind of dark love story in a way that Gabriel is under the thrall, you could say, of Faith Green, who is his handler, his MI6 handler, and who is uh, who knows so much more than he does, but he can't not do her bidding. And so I think it's a very intriguing relationship of, spy mistress and spy. And she says to him in the novel at one stage, "You are my spy." And he's happy with that designation. And of course, he's erotically, obsessed with her because she's a very attractive woman as well as a powerful woman. But the relationship is fraught. And she sort of plays with him because I think she knows what he thinks or feels about her. So it's going to recur in the trilogy, the Gabriel Dax Faith Green relationship. And no doubt it will be a bit of a roller coaster, but it just adds to the intrigue. I mean, it is a spy novel, unashamedly, but as I always say, it's a spy novel with extras because it's about the time, it's about the Cold War, the history. It's about Gabriel as a human being. He's troubled. He's being psychoanalyzed by another enigmatic woman who he can't quite get a handle on. So it's there's all the ingredients of a I hope of a rich, compelling novel are there, as well as as I say, all the tropes of a spy novel too.
Well, there certainly are. You've mentioned the psychoanalyst, and then there's espionage. There's also a character, the artist Ines Blanco,
Yeah.
who who complains about the art world. And so, with sort of psychology, espionage, and the art world, there is a theme of, I think you're a skeptic about the art world.
Well, yes, I am. I mean, it's I've written a lot about art. I've written serious essays about artists who I like, but I'm no fool, and I can see how that world, the contemporary art world, is completely unregulated, and uh, maybe it's always been like this. But the people who buy expensive art are often not well informed and very rich, not to say stupid. So they can become marks, they become targets for dealers and for artists. And the art world today is just a morass of corruption, and I would say it's a very corrupt world, and people are being ripped off right, left, and center. But it's a very small elite that's being ripped off, and because I've had experience of the art world as a because I was on the editorial board of this magazine, Modern Painters, and because of my own art hoax, uh, my little book about Nat Tate, a fictitious artist, I'm sort of very aware of the easiness in which people can be corrupted and steal from others. So it is a fascinating world, and it's an elite moneyed world, but it's buyer beware. It's very very easy to be ripped off.
It feels like the spy world, though. Not exactly, but similar
Well, I
themes.
think in the sense that, duplicity, if you like, is the word that would cover both worlds. But it's, the contemporary art market is a commercial retail market. So in that sense, it's different from spying. But there's a massive amount of pretense and pretension and duplicity and corruption. Uh, so they do overlap to a degree, and they are. I find them. I find it very fascinating, and I've written short stories about the art world. I've written, my own experience of creating Nat Tate, along with the late great David Bowie, and launching that hoax in 1998, a long time ago. You couldn't do it now because it's pre-Google, but just showed me how gullible, if you like, the punters are, and for unscrupulous dealers. And I have met many of them, and I know many of the scams that are employed. It's a wonderfully intriguing world to write about. So yeah, there is an overlap, but in a way, the contemporary art world is sort of about you know covert theft, whereas the uh, espionage world is there's more life and death involved.
I guess also there's psychoanalyst who in the novel it's hilarious because I don't know if I'm giving it away, but she isn't necessarily got lots of letters after her name. It's probably fair to say,
Mm.
but she's at least effective. So because Gabriel does get a benefit, and
Yes, he does.
yeah, but I wondered, psychology is a sort of slightly younger discipline. Is there also an element of like espionage and like the art world, a sort of element of duplicity?
Well, I think so. I mean, I don't know why I'm so interested in Freud and psychoanalysis. It's just something that I keep reading about. I'm very intrigued by. I've never been psychoanalyzed myself, but I sort of feel that, like it or not, we're all Freudians now. The unconscious is part of our life, and the talking cure is, can be useful, I think, but it's unscientific. Though Freud pretended it was scientific, it's not. It's just his notions that he sort of made, respectable, and a whole industry has been set up on the back of these ideas that nobody can disprove, because they're just Freud's ideas about human nature. And yet it has a profound grip on our thinking, I feel, even if you poo poo it. You're sort of aware of kind of Freudian concepts and ideas in your own life, and so it's just, again, this is one of the definitions of the novel. It seems to me that any novel is the sum of all the things that the novelist is interested in at the time of writing. And I'm very interested in psychoanalysis. So I invented this German woman who's loosely based on Freud's daughter, who set herself up as a psychiatrist in London after the war. But anybody can be a psychoanalyst. You could be a psychoanalyst. I could be a psychoanalyst if we had patients who were prepared to pay us money. So and this is exactly, I don't think we're giving anything crucial away, but this is exactly what Gabriel's psychoanalyst is. She calls herself Dr. Katharina Haas, but she's not a doctor. She's just somebody who was analyzed herself by Sigmund Freud and thought, I can do this. And she sets herself up in a nice house in Hampstead and psychoanalyzes and charges quite a lot of money for an hour's session. So the whole thing, again, maybe you're right, it links up with this idea of duplicity, whether it's spying the art world or psychoanalysis. If you're plausible and convincing, you can get away with almost anything in this world, it seems to me. So maybe shrinks are part of that triumvirate.
Yes. I was very keen to ask you about adaptations, because I know you've worked a lot on adaptations of Evelyn Waugh with the Sword of Honor trilogy and your own books. Do you have books that you always think, I would love to adapt it for the screen? It's not something that you go through your mind whilst you're writing. It's something that if it happens afterwards, you would like that would be great. But if not, it's sort of not really a
Yeah, well,
motivating factor.
I've written a lot about this because I do both. Because I've directed a film, I've produced films, I've written dozens of films. The two worlds are entirely different. What you can do in a novel is limitless. What you can do in a film is covered with parameters, impossibilities, and so on. Because, and this sounds very stupid, film is photography. Everything is through a lens of a camera. So it's relentlessly overpoweringly objective. Whereas in a novel, subjectivity is effortless. So when you adapt a novel for a film, you just can't do half the things you can do in a novel. And because films are around about 2 hours, let's say, or 90 minutes, 2 hours, usually in any adaptation, 50% or 70% of the novel can't be filmed. You mentioned Evelyn Waugh's Sword of Honor trilogy, which I adapted. I adapted it as a 6-hour series. There's three middle-sized novels. And then the producer said, could you make it 3 hours? So I cut it down to 3 hours. It's actually a very good adaptation of the novels, but there's a massive amount left out. And that's the compromise you make when you move from novels to screenwriting. I think Martin Amis, the late Martin Amis, a friend of mine, put it very succinctly. He said, writing a novel is like swimming in the sea. Writing a film is like swimming in the bath. You're still afloat and in water, immersed in water, but you're crowded in by the edge of the bath. And that's the problem about film writing. Film has its strengths, of course, but compared to the novel, it's a very crude narrative form. And the freedoms, the illimitable freedoms of the novel are just not there in film. So I never think of the film adaptation of any novel I write, because otherwise I'd write a 60-page novel. If it gets adapted, fine, wonderful, but it will be a different kind of beast. It won't be it has to be a good film, not a faithful representation of the novel.
Hello, Ollie here. Please forgive my interruption, but I wanted to let you know that at Aspects of History, we produce a digital magazine featuring articles, interviews, short stories, and book reviews of the best historical writing available. Authors featured including Ben Macintyre, Lucy Worsley, Andrew Roberts, and plenty more. An annual subscription is available for only $9.99. That's pounds or dollars. Yep, you heard that right. That's 6 issues for under £10 or dollars. Head over to aspectsofhistory.com to subscribe, where you can also gift subscriptions. Now back to the show. When you were writing Solo, which is set in 69,
Yeah.
That's the heyday of the Fleming. It's Sean Connery's.
Yeah, but I deliberately didn't think about the movies, the Bond movies, because they're so distant from Fleming's novels, even
Yeah.
the early ones. One forgets that most of Fleming's Bond novels were written in the 1950s, and they're very much of their time. And so I went back to Fleming and ignored the Bond movies, even though I have worked and have written scripts for three of the Bond actors, Sean Connery, Pierce Brosnan,
Yes.
and Daniel Craig. And I got to know Sean Connery when he was in a film version of my novel Good Man in Africa. But I think he's, in a way, because he was the first Bond, he's sort of set the benchmark. And Bond is Scottish. He's half Scottish, half Swiss. He's not English, and he went to a Scottish boarding school. He was kicked out of Eton and went to Fettes College in Edinburgh. So there's a very Scottish theme to James Bond. And of course, the Fleming family were also Scottish, so it's not surprising. But I just went back to the novels, read them all again, taking notes, and everything that seems odd or strange about Solo is sourced in Fleming. Things like Bond was a very nervous flyer, for example. Bond didn't like women who painted their fingernails. Bond was very up to speed on women's couture, and Fleming gave him all his tastes, though James Bond is not Ian Fleming, but he gave Bond all his quirks. Bond will vomit if he sees something gruesome. He often cries, and you don't see that in the movies, do you? But when you go back to the novels, a whole different persona appears, and that's one of the things I wanted to do in Solo was uh, paint a portrait of Bond aged 45 in 1969, according to Ian Fleming, a middle-aged man. Apparently, you have to retire as an OO when you hit 45. So I wanted for readers to get a sense of that mythic individual, but one that had been sourced in the 14 Fleming novels and had nothing to do with the movie Bonds, which is what everybody thinks about.
But it's almost impossible to detach the figure of Bond when you picture him. For me, it's Sean Connery.
Yeah, but it's interesting. Fleming was asked about what did James Bond look like, and he said he looks like there's an American singer-songwriter called Hoagy Carmichael. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He wrote Stardust. He's written classic songs, and Hoagy Carmichael is a dark, almost swarthy, handsome man. And Fleming obviously knew him, and that was the image he had of Bond in his mind. That's what Bond looked like. And he looks a bit like Sean Connery in the sense that they're handsome, dark-haired men. But so there's a very clear identity. If you want to know what Fleming's Bond looked like, go Google Hoagy Carmichael, and you'll see this sort of lean, handsome singer-songwriter. But so Fleming had he had a model in his mind. But of course, the film versions of the Bonds sort of dominate people's thinking, whether it's Daniel Craig or Brosnan or Connery or Roger Moore, who's totally atypical. But the movie Bonds, in a way, have overtaken the literary Bonds, and everybody forgets that these 1950s novels were the source of all these films.
It's the capacity for alcohol that I'm always amazed by in the Bond novels. That actually, I think Gabriel Dax has that. Is it a talent?
Well, I mean, everybody drank. I mean, my very respectable parents drank, gin at lunchtime and whiskey in the evening. My father was a doctor. My mother was a teacher. One forgets that how much boozing went on before it became, a sort of health issue. And Bond, reading the Fleming novels, it was very clear to me. I was like some sort of anxious wife counting the number of drinks that Bond consumed. Was a functioning alcoholic. There's no, and Ian Fleming was an alcoholic. He was a 2 bottles of vodka a day man. plus 80 cigarettes. So no wonder he died age 54. But Bond is a massive boozer. And there's a great line, I think it's in You Only Live Twice, which is that your Bond realized that the 13th large whiskey had been a mistake. Well, what's that's a bottle and a half, and there's a great moment in From Russia with Love when he flies from London to Istanbul, stopping off in Rome to refuel, where he drinks two Negronis, stopping off in Athens, where he drinks two Ouzos, and then on the Athens to Istanbul leg of the flight, he drinks a bottle of claret. So he must have fallen off the plane by the time he arrived in Istanbul to complete his mission. So if you read the Bond novels, it's all about drinking, but actually that's true of the time. It's just it was not regarded as something dangerous and unhealthy. And I remember my father, the doctor, coming home. He'd been up for 7 hours at his clinics in Africa, and he'd come home and pour himself a massive pink gin and then have another massive pink gin before he had lunch. So, and my mother would join him. So it just was part of the culture, if you like, of, I suppose, Western, populations, that people drank in enormous quantities without thinking about it, and smoked constantly. That's the other thing. It's and so in a way, to get the period right, you have to have a lot of smoking and drinking going on, because that was what it was like then.
Yeah, and Gabriel smokes the Gitane, which are they the filterless ones he's smoking?
No, you can get Gitane with filters. There's a bit of a debate going on actually with me and my editors, because there are various types of Gitane. There are unfiltered Gitane in soft packs. There are filtered Gitane in hard packs. I just wanted him to smoke French cigarettes for some reason. I think because when I was at university, I lived with two guys who both smoked Gitane. So somehow that smell is part of my history. So but it's there were various types. You could get French cigarettes with yellow paper. They're all Caporal, and all these powerful brown tobacco cigarettes were quite different from American style cigarettes or British style cigarettes. There's different. Uh, who knows? I've never smoked. I'm a non-smoker, but having lived with two smokers for a couple of years, I sort of got into the culture of it. So I just thought it would be interesting that Gabriel, who is, he's a writer, he's a travel writer, something of an intellectual, and his cigarette choice reflects that.
Certainly, certainly. There's definitely a love of the travel writing in there. So I wanted to ask you about that actually. He's a big admirer of, I think, Lawrence Durrell among
Yeah.
many of course. I suppose Patrick Leigh Fermor would not have written enough by then to have had a name, would he?
No, but I think I've always had this. There's another travel writer who I don't mention, who's called Norman Lewis, who wrote Naples 44 is most famous, but he's a very good travel writer, Norman Lewis, a very interesting man. And I'm convinced he was a spy. And I'm convinced that Ian Fleming recruited him after World War II. And when Norman Lewis, traveled to Cuba, for example, he was reporting back to Ian Fleming. I think being a travel writer is a perfect cover for a spy. And that's where I got this idea to make Gabriel a travel writer, because, why wouldn't you be in Albania or Poland or wherever, because you're writing a book about rivers, So it's great cover. But and a lot of writers have been spies. I'm pretty sure Paddy Lee Firma was one. Graham Greene was one. A lot of some spies become writers. Le Carre, as for example. But there's an overlap between the professions, I think, and what writers do. Let's put it another way: the way writers see the world is very similar to the way the spy sees the world. I think we note things that most people don't note. We're interested in detail and minutiae in the way that most people aren't, but in the way that spies are, because noticing details is how they keep themselves safe. And so there is an overlap between the novelist and the spy, and I think that may also explain why so many novelists write spy novels. Because there's something, something familiar about the worldview, and even though nobody's going to come and kill a novelist, but the stakes are higher. But somehow the way the gaze on the world is the same, and I think that that is a clear link.
I was fascinated reading about the first part of the book set in the Congo just after independence. It's a tragic story, Patrice Lumumba. And it sounds like from what you were saying just before we started recording that there'll be other elements of, countries struggling with the influence of the West and the Cold War, I suppose. Lumumba is a particularly tragic figure. Have you always wanted to bring him out in a novel? Because I know you've got a deep love of Africa from
Oh,
your
I
from your
was I
childhood.
was born in Africa. I was born in Ghana and grew up there and in Nigeria. But it's very interesting because I knew the name Patrice Lumumba when I was a 10-year-old because he was a Ghana was very supportive of him. Kwame Nkrumah, who was the president of Ghana at the time, was a great ally of Lumumba, and I know from even our cook would talk about Lumumba. He was a kind of hero to West Africans, and it was a clear act of regime change engineered by the CIA, MI6, and the Belgian Secret Service. And they were worried because this is a time of intense paranoia about communism that the Congo would become, as they put it, a Cuba in Africa, that there would be a communist leader in this country, which, it just happened, supplied most of the world's uranium to make atom bombs and H bombs. And so when Lumumba came to power, they decided to take him out, and they did. And it's the most brutal. He was tortured, beaten up, regularly and then shot by firing squad. His body was dismembered. And this is the elected prime minister of a democratic country. Again, it shows the appeal of going back in time to where this sort of Western hegemony was taken for granted. And it's the same in, this other country I'm very interested in, Guatemala. Eisenhower's government engineered regime change and they got rid of a president and then they assassinated his successor. So that whole kind of CIA Western meddling in world order, if you like, is what makes the 60s and the 70s such an interesting area to explore as a novelist. But Lumumba's case is particularly tragic, and it's not well known that that MI6, our security service, was involved in his assassination. It's come out now, but at the time it was seen as a Belgian issue, but in fact the CIA and MI6 were very heavily implicated. So it's in all my books, all my fictions, there are big chunks of reality, and so the Lumumba case and the Cuban Missile Crisis figure largely in this novel. So it's not fantastical spying. It's very rooted in the kind of geopolitics of the time.
Do you remember the Cuban Missile Crisis?
I do, I do. I mean, just as I remember the name Patrice Lumumba, which was being mentioned by the African, the Ghanaian staff we had, just as in conversation. So I remember the Cuban Missile Crisis because I was again a little boy, 10 years old, at a prep school in the north of Scotland, and I think our headmaster must have mentioned it to us in some sort of assembly. But I remember praying at evening prayers that the world wouldn't be destroyed by nuclear war. I mean, what did I know about nuclear war? But I was very aware of this enormous threat that the world was sort of on the brink of annihilation, and that's in a little prep school in the north of Scotland, and and it's a very interesting episode. It only lasted about 2 weeks in terms of the public knowledge of it, but it had rumbled on long before. But so I brought in that incident into Gabriel's Moon just again to kind of root it in its time and to have real events, interlocking with the fictional events of the novel.
And that sense in the novel of the intelligence services have advance warning of all this kind of stuff, which I suppose they would, but it
Yes, I think I did a lot of research and everybody knew what was going on. I mean, in government, in the US government, the British government, etc. They knew that the Russians were building bases in Cuba for intercontinental missiles, but it didn't become public until Kennedy, who was the new president, went on television and alerted the world to this risk. And for that's in a way when the Cuban Missile Crisis became public property and everybody became worried, and there was a standoff between Russia and America, and and Russia backed off. Why? That's the interesting question, and this is what I posit in the novel, because the Americans had a vastly superior nuclear arsenal compared to the Russians, and American weapons worked and Russian weapons probably didn't, as we've seen in Ukraine. They are a massively inefficient military. So why did Khrushchev pull back? I think he knew he was on a losing streak, and he was given a face-saving excuse, but the world retreated from the brink of nuclear, World War III, and we all got back to our normal lives. But for me, as a little kid, I remember that palpable sense of fear that the world was going to end, and I assume that was prevalent throughout the world. That America and Russia could go to war, and the nuclear Armageddon would arrive.
Where do you think we are today then? Because, we have once again a sort of Cold War developing.
Well, I think that old expression, mutually assured destruction, in a way, is the safest bet against World War III starting again, because everything there will be no winners. So why start it? So, but Putin keeps rattling his nuclear saber. But what do I know? I just think nobody's going to start World War III. It's just not in anybody's interests. Because there are so many nuclear powers now, in a way, the various threats seem to cancel each other out. Will Pakistan bomb India and vice versa? Will Iran develop a nuclear weapon? Israel is the fourth biggest nuclear power in the world. Nobody ever talks about Israel's nuclear arsenal. They've got over 400 warheads. In the Six-Day War back in the 60s, they were going to drop a nuclear bomb in the Sinai Desert to show that they had nuclear weapons, just to scare everybody off. But it's the elephant in the room in that conflict, that Israel is a nuclear power, a significant nuclear power, but nobody mentions it anymore. Again, I'm just a consumer of news. I'm not obsessed with politics, but I try to keep aware of what's going on. But I do think nuclear threats are what they are, threats. I mean, will North Korea bomb South Korea? No, because North Korea will then be obliterated. So why would you want to be obliterated? So I sort of think that this concept of mutually assured destruction, MAD, as its acronym is known, is what keeps us vaguely safe from annihilation.
Well, okay, so we're, I think, coming to the end of the conversation, and I know listeners would be very keen to learn a little bit more about some of your the spy writers that you admire most. I know, we've talked Fleming and you've mentioned Graham Greene as well, but is there something of interest in Eric Ambler, with the protagonist being thrown in like Gabriel is in Gabriel's Moon?
I mean, I know Eric Ambler, but I think it's more that because I'm not unlike, say, Green or Le Carre, who were spies and who knew the machinations of that. I don't know anything about how how spying. So all my spies have to be in a way reluctant or recruited by the organization, and so they're often in a state of ignorance. I think of not James Bond, obviously, but the other spy novels I've written, Restless and Waiting for Sunrise. The spies are sort of reluctant spies. So I think that it's more about that world and exploring it that attracts me. Just um, using it as a kind of magnifying glass on emotions and situations and predicaments that we all instinctively understand and can relate to. And that's what's unusual, whereas you cannot necessarily relate to crime novels or horror novels or science fiction novels. I think any reader can relate to a spy novel because, writ small, their lives probably align with what the spy is going through.
I'm so fascinated. I'm just going to sneak this one in. I'm so fascinated by the language that spies use, that novelists use, and now the two are almost interchangeable. I know you mentioned termites and moles in your novel, but mole I think it was Le Carre first, and now has become certainly tradecraft has become language
Yes.
in the spy services. But you get confused as to which is which.
Yeah, well, I make up my own now because I don't want to. I mean, I've written a great deal about Le Carre and I know his work extremely well. And he has, in a way, set the benchmark, but you obviously don't want to use his expressions. So I invent my own expressions to differentiate my novels from his. But as I say, he was a spook himself, so he knew the inner workings of that world, whereas all my spies are strangers in a way and trying to figure out what the hell is going on.
Well, that's what made the novel so enjoyable. William, this has been absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Oliver. Great pleasure.
Thank you very much for listening. Links are in the show notes, and if you want to get in touch, you can through Spotify or our email address. But until then, thank you and good night.